All right, so chapter one, just understanding our environment, going to be a little bit of a more basic sort of background chapter, just going over some things related to environmental science in general, and even just science itself. So before we get into this, just take a second on your own and kind of think about what science is, and if you have a definition of what it kind of looks like in your head. And then my definition, you can see here, just the process by which we understand the universe, and then the organisms and the different substances within it. And then I like this picture at the bottom here because it shows sort of shows just says science, of course, but it kind of shows the different aspects, or at least some of the different aspects. So we've got DNA for the S, magnet for C, just some sort of test tube with some substance in it for I, a shell for the E, just basic nitrogen for N, a crescent moon for the other C, and then just some leaves for the E. And I particularly like it for this class, environmental science, because as we're going to see throughout the entire quarter, is environmental science in particular is really just a collection of a whole bunch of different sciences. So we're going to have a little bit of biology, a little bit of chemistry, physics, all of it kind of mashed together to get a better understanding of the planet that we live on. And then stepping back from environmental science and just thinking about science in general, we do have just sort of basic principles that sort of guide how we conduct that science and what science is and how we sort of perform it. And probably the most basic one is just going to be this first one, empiricism. We understand through the observations we make. So we have to actually go out and observe things, collect data, whatever it's going to be, so that we can actually have those pieces of information to get that understanding from. And the second one, uniformitarianism, basically just saying that science, if it's going to be something that we can trust, something that we can believe in, it should follow basic principles that are going to be true in different spaces at different times. So if you think about basic like chemical reactions and things like that, they're not going to be fundamentally different if we do them in one space on one day versus somewhere else on another. And then the third one, Occam's razor, you may have heard of before, is basically just saying if there's two possible explanations for something, the one that's more fantastic, the one that's more extraordinary, there's more burden on that one to kind of prove that it's correct. So generally, we want to go with the simpler approach if there's two equally plausible options. And then with science, a lot of times people think it's proving something. And that's not exactly true. We try to get a better understanding, but there's always going to be some level of uncertainty. And that could be in terms of the exact measurements we make. The instruments we use are never going to be exactly perfect all the way down to a super precise measurement. There's always going to be a little bit of uncertainty with those. And then also just with the understanding we have, we can never possibly have every single piece of information. So what we're doing as we try to go through this is take the information we do have, come up with the best possible explanation we can, and then as we get new evidence, new pieces of information, we'll kind of adjust our understanding and go from there. And that kind of boils into point 6 as well. Proof is going to be elusive. That's why a lot of the times, if you see here, theory of evolution, it's just sort of an idea we have and the evidence supports it. But if we ever got a piece of evidence that refutes it, we would have to come up with some sort of new understanding to explain whatever that principle is going to be. And then these next couple, we're going to look at when we go into the scientific method specifically. But it's basically just talking about how we can go about testing whatever hypotheses we're going to do. And then ultimately, when we get that data in science, we'll see that if you know anybody that's ever conducted research, maybe in grad school or something like that, when they report their data, when they publish their papers, what they do is they submit it to some journal, and then that journal has other scientists that they contact. They send the paper to them. They kind of read through it, look through the data, decide if what that scientist is saying is accurate, if the data supports it. They usually have to make some sort of adjustments to it as well. But that's sort of a process where the scientists are kind of getting checked by each other. And then going back to that uncertainty one quick, like I said, with any measurement we make, there's always going to be a little bit of imprecision with it. And that's kind of what we're showing here just with this graph quick. So with this one on the x-axis, we have time. On the y-axis, we have distance. And they're just showing that with each of those measurements, with the time, we could only be precise to 0.2 seconds. So if we're reporting it as 2 seconds, it really could be 1.8 to 2.2. Or with the distance one, plus or minus half a meter. So if we look at, this one's pretty close to 6. So with that measurement, if they're reporting it as 6, it really could be 6.5. It could be 5.5. It's going to be somewhere within that range. So like I was saying, there's uncertainty in terms of the measurements themselves. There's also uncertainty in the fact that we never have every single piece of data, every single piece of information. And then with the scientific method, like I was saying, that's kind of the general process by which we conduct an experiment, the way we perform science. Doesn't always have to look exactly like this, but this is just a good sort of way to simply represent what science is. And then if we just go through it quickly, you start by just making some observation, having some sort of question. So if you think about it just very simplistically, it could just be walking out in the woods one day and you see something, see some bug, see some sort of tree, whatever it's going to be, that's going to raise some sort of question. And then you're going to go to the library, you're going to go to the internet, wherever it's going to be, you're going to research whatever that topic is, try to get an understanding of what existing information is already out there. Because with science, the final point on that slide before was a cumulative process. And what that means is you can work together in a research group, you can work as a team, have different people do different aspects of whatever that project's going to be, but also you can build upon the work of the people that have come before you. So you don't have to redo, you don't have to completely reinvent the wheel. You can kind of take what we already know and then just build upon that. So that's what the second step is kind of showing you. You're going to gather the information that already exists. And then based on that, you're going to come up with some hypothesis, whatever you think may be the outcome. And you're going to develop some way you can actually sort of test that. And ultimately, whatever that's going to look different depending on what the actual test is going to be. But you'll be able to record and collect data. Could be actual numbers, could be observations just based on whatever you're seeing in the field. But based on what you collect, you'll analyze that. You'll try to connect it back to what was already known, connect it back to your hypothesis. And it doesn't necessarily have to prove your hypothesis. It could refute it completely, prove that what you were sort of expecting is completely untrue. It could totally support it, could be sort of in between. But based on that, you're going to then report whatever you've concluded, and then basically start this process again with a slightly different question, going in a slightly different direction, or you may try to repeat that with a slightly different change, whatever it may be. And again, science isn't always going to follow all of these steps exactly like it is, and those steps are obviously going to be different, but that's just the general process we're looking at here. And then with these, depending on the experiment, you may hear things like a controlled study, blind versus double blind, often in sort of pharmaceutical tests. And then with these, we've also got dependent versus independent variables, and sometimes the independent variable will be referred to as an explanatory variable. And I'll cover that in this next slide. But right here is just sort of showing that scientific method, sort of broken down slightly differently, but it's still those same basic steps. But the reason I wanted to include it is just sort of this sort of circular piece here, where it goes back on itself a little bit, just to show that the point of science isn't to just prove what you think. It's to get a better understanding of whatever actually is true. And a lot of the times you will be wrong if you're conducting some sort of experiment. So it's important to just kind of take whatever that is, and rather than trying to fit it into whatever you expected to happen, to make those conclusions reflect what actually is the true reality. But go back to the independent and dependent variables like I was talking about there. The independent variable as you can see up here, the one thing you actually change. So if we're looking at the growth of a plant, the independent variable in this case is going to be what liquid we actually use to water those plants. So we could use soda, we could use juice, we could use water. And then the dependent variable is going to be the thing that we're measuring, the thing that's going to be dependent on that other variable. So in this case, the height of the plant is going to be dependent on what liquid we're using to water it. And then with these experiments, we have what's called controlled variables. And these are going to be things that you would want to keep the same throughout all three of these. So if you look, A, B, and C are getting different liquids poured on them. But what we would want to do is make sure that the plant's the same. If we're measuring different plants in addition to different liquids, we can't be certain the different level of growth is actually due to the liquid itself. It could be due to the plant. Same thing if we've got different pot sizes, if we use different amounts of these liquids, different soil types, all of those could affect the plant growth as well. So if we wanted to really focus on the liquid itself, we would want to make sure we keep all of these controlled variables exactly the same between A, B, and C. So that's just kind of the things you want to consider if you were ever setting up an experiment. Because again, if we had, in addition to the different liquids, if we change the amount of those liquids, any difference in these heights, we can't be sure if it's due to the liquid itself or if it's due to the amount of the liquid. Likely it'll be a combination of the two, but we can't be certain what's causing those changes. And then just to go one step further, if you were to do something like this, ideally, sometimes you couldn't be dependent on the resources you have available, but ideally you would want to do A, B, and C, and then you would want to do all three of these 3 times each so that you've got a larger set of data. Because the larger the set of the data, the more comfortable you can be in whatever conclusions you draw. Because if we think about it, if we were to do this experiment just with one of each of these setups, we could just have sort of a bad seed in one of these, and then it may just be that bad plant rather than the liquid itself. But if we had 100 of each of these, we'd be able to draw a more representative conclusion. And with this, you're likely to never really be setting up experiments like that. At least I would suspect you may be, depending on kind of what you wind up doing in the future. But with that, one thing you can kind of think about is when you're evaluating, especially in the news, when you're evaluating different things, you'd want to pay attention to things like that. So the way experiments are designed, the size of them, the sample itself, and that could be, rather than experiments, you could be thinking about polls that are being reported in the news, whatever it may be. You'd want to pay attention to those details. And all of that's going to be sort of critical thinking, something that we're going to hope to develop further throughout the quarter. And then with these, like I was saying, I'm presenting it from the aspect of evaluating science, but with these steps, we can really apply this to anything. So another thing is the potential bias of the researcher. So a lot of the times research is funded by different companies, different organizations, and you'd want to make sure that when you're evaluating the information that they're presenting, you'd want to make sure that you know where that funding is coming from, because a lot of the times you'll see organizations related to things like tobacco, the fossil fuel industries. They'll pump a whole bunch of money into different projects, different experiments, whatever it may be. And then they'll take just the little bit of information that kind of supports whatever claim they want to make, and they'll put that out there. So you want to make sure that you're aware of where that information is coming from. And the same thing anytime you read something online, anytime you see something in the news, you want to kind of think about who's presenting that information. So you can think about any potential way they might be skewing the presentation of that. And like I talked about, the uncertainty of results, with that, you can use that and other statistics to kind of make a lot of points, say something that they may not exactly be saying. So you always want to be sort of aware of that. 4, I think, kind of goes, it's pretty self-explanatory. A lot of times people say things, that aren't exactly fact, but if they say it with authority, it kind of gets thought of as fact. So you want to make sure you're really thinking about what people are saying. And then finally, the last one I want to say is correlation versus causation. So just because two things are sort of connected or somebody presents them as connected doesn't necessarily mean that they are. And one example of this is horse owners often live longer. So people sort of link those two together and think owning a horse makes you live longer, when in reality, people that own horses are more likely to be more likely to have access to healthcare, more likely to be more affluent in general. So they're more likely to have those resources to help them live longer rather than the owning of a horse itself. So you want to kind of make sure that just because two things are presented as connected doesn't necessarily mean there's a causation there. Okay. And then with environmental science, like I was saying, it's going to be a connection of a whole bunch of different sciences, and we're going to be looking at just the Earth in general and the different, we're going to call them spheres, but we're going to see the atmosphere that you're aware of, the biosphere, which is the living organisms and things like that. But before we get into those spheres, like I was saying, the reason I particularly am interested in environmental science is because it takes things like chemistry, which I also teach, but then it also gives you this connection to the different sciences. So biology, geology, oceanography, atmospheric science. We'll see a little bit with astronomy. But then also related to it is you've got sort of the application of the environmental science, which is then going to take into consideration things like economics, ethics, sociology, sort of how we treat people and the environment. So it's a very broad subject that takes a lot of different topics and kind of crams them together. But like I was saying, with the Earth, we can kind of think of it in terms of these different spheres, and we'll see there's actually going to be a couple more rather than just these four, but these four are kind of the most basic ones that people think of. So the atmosphere, you're probably aware of, just the air surrounding the Earth. The lithosphere, we're just going to be using that to refer to the solid Earth, so the crust and things like that. Hydrosphere, just all of the water on the planet, and then biosphere, excuse me. Biosphere referring to the life on the planet. And those are the four main ones, but we'll also sometimes see there are a couple more. So the cryosphere sometimes gets lumped into the hydrosphere. So the cryosphere is just the portion of the Earth that's composed of ice. So because ice is also water, sometimes they kind of just get lumped together. Sometimes they get separated out, but they're pretty well related. And we'll see when we go through the quarter, we'll talk about both of those spheres. And then the final one, which sometimes gets overlooked in environmental science, a lot of times people think environmental science, so they think about green, so going out in the woods, mountains, they think about the oceans, which of course going to be huge sort of focuses of this quarter. But the anthrosphere is maybe the most important because it's the one that has the most impact on the environment. It's the one that we're responsible for. So the anthrosphere is going to be the part of the environment that is made or modified by humans. So cities, bridges, roads, anything that we directly change is going to be considered the anthrosphere. And then environmental science is really going to be focused on sort of the interactions and the exchanges between all of these different spheres. So if we think about the atmosphere and the hydrosphere, so the air and the water, we're going to see movement between different substances, between those different organisms, different energy even, and we're going to be focused on those different spheres, but as the connection of them as well. And just to show the connection a little bit, and just sort of the connection in terms of the spheres as well as the entire planet as a whole. When we're looking at environmental science, one aspect of it is going to be pollutants and different things that are released into the environment that we don't necessarily want to be in the environment. And one thing that makes environmental science particularly sort of challenging in terms of protecting the environment and protecting the organisms in the environment is that it's not localized. Everything we do is going to have a larger effect, because all of these pollutants that are released into the environment, they're not just going to stay in one place. They're going to have the ability to travel. So as we go through the quarter, we're going to see that what we do in one place is going to have an effect somewhere else. So just looking at this image here quick, volatile just means it's a substance that's got the ability to go into the gas phase. So it could be a solid or a liquid, and then it's going to wind up turning into a gas. So what it's showing here is some substance starts near the equator where it's going to be warm. So that hot temperature causes that substance to go into the gas phase, and then it's actually able to travel through the atmosphere and can move thousands of miles away. And in some cases, some of those chemicals may get to sort of a mid-latitude, something like maybe we are here in Washington, where it's a little bit colder than the equator, but it's not quite freezing. But then even more volatile substances can continue going all the way up to sort of the North Pole, and then they'll deposit there where it's freezing. Same thing if it goes high up into the mountains where it's colder, they'll deposit up there. So we've actually been able to measure, and one of the people I worked with in grad school would actually go up to Alaska each summer and measure chemicals there that would never be used, never be produced in Alaska, because they were like in a very remote part of Alaska, like far away from where anybody lived. So there was nowhere where those chemicals would come from in that environment. But because they have the ability to travel through the atmosphere, he was able to measure those chemicals in the snow up there. So we're going to see, like I said, throughout the quarter, there's going to be a global connection. We're going to see everything we do is going to have an impact on something else in the environment. And some of the other topics we're going to talk about, climate change is going to be a big one. A little bit of a contentious topic. Some people tend to kind of brush it aside, not totally believe in it. If you're in that camp, hopefully by the end of this quarter, you're kind of a different perspective. We're also going to be looking at the air, water, and soil quality. So that's going to be focused on sort of the contaminants within those and how we can keep them clean, and sort of the problems facing them. Population growth in terms of humans, as well as just the different organisms in the environment, and how that affects the amount of resources we have, such as food production. If we think about a larger population, we're going to need larger amounts of food to be produced so that we can feed that population. Same thing with the resources. And then all of this is going to sort of boil down into how that impacts the biodiversity. So the different amounts of different organisms that are present throughout the environment. More biodiversity is always going to be advantageous because it gives the environment more strength, more resilience to different changes. It's able to withstand more stress. And then ultimately at the end, we'll be wrapping up the quarter by looking at the alternatives for energy, so green energy such as wind, hydro, solar, geothermal, a couple different other ones. And then with that, there'll also be a little bit related to the storage of waste, because nuclear waste is also going to be something that we look at, or nuclear energy, excuse me, is going to be something we also look at that point. And then with this, if you do have any topics that you look at the textbook and you don't see them covered, but you were kind of hoping we would talk about them, let me know. There may be a chance to kind of have that as something we have as a discussion, or we may be able to kind of switch something up to maybe have that be a little bit more of a focus than I had originally planned. But just to go through these quickly before you kind of get them in more depth later in the quarter. Climate change, so you can see here, the more red colors are going to be areas where the temperature has increased over the last 50 to 60 years. And you can see that's pretty much the entire planet. And that's going to be due to the increased use of fossil fuels. So the combustion of those fossil fuels lead to greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, which then trap more of the solar energy, winds up heating up the atmosphere, warming the planet. And of course, we've seen increases in wildfires, the warming of the ocean, which is somewhat responsible for things like the coral reef sort of dying off a bit, and then that's connected to a whole bunch of other issues that we'll look at too throughout the quarter. Like I said, air, soil, and water quality, kind of looking at it in the lens of what contaminants are present, measuring those, what effects they have, sort of what's the reasonable level that they can be at where it's safe for humans to drink that water, breathe that air, grow plants in that soil, whatever it may be. And a lot of that focus, at least in this country, is on the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. So the EPA monitors the air, the soil, the water, a whole bunch of stuff for a whole bunch of different contaminants throughout the country. And then they have somewhat recently had a little bit of their power taken away by the Supreme Court, though. And then just some of the poor examples of environmental quality that we may talk about throughout the quarter. So the Hudson River in New York. So I'm from New York, right near the Hudson River. But in the 20th century, General Electric dumped a whole bunch of PCBs, so polychlorinated biphenyls, in the Hudson River. And then those are chemicals that are toxic, but they also stick around in the environment forever. So General Electric had to pay a whole bunch of money, and they were supposed to clean up the Hudson River. And for the most part, they have. It's not perfect still. You're still not supposed. I know people that did. It was kind of gross. I don't know why they would, but you weren't supposed to eat fish out of the Hudson River because they still contain some of those PCBs. And this was, like I said, in the 20th century. So I want to say like 1950s maybe. But more recent, we've seen Flint, Michigan, water contaminated with lead. They haven't had clean drinking water. And that was more of an issue with the economics and how they handled their drinking water system. But we've also seen in Mississippi there without clean drinking water. These are going to be environmental quality issues. In Missouri, in the, I want to say I'm going to get the year wrong. But somebody went around spraying dioxin, which was a pesticide, and then the entire town had to be evacuated and basically became a ghost town. And then you may be more familiar with the videos or the pictures of the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland that caught fire at various points in the past. That was one of the sort of the initial images that kind of got the public concerned about the environment and helped push the concept of environmental protection to sort of the forefront of the public. Whoops. Oh, and then before I go on to the next slide, I should also say, in addition to the science of sort of these issues and situations, like I said, when I had sort of that image of the different aspects of our environmental science, it got economics and ethics and things like that. We're also going to look to see how these situations and often the negative aspects of environmental science, how that burden is often impacting poorer communities and communities of minority populations more often than it is affluent white populations. But like I was saying, the Cuyahoga River, the images of that being on fire kind of brought the need for environmental protection to the forefront in the public's mind. Also, what is sort of thought to be, or what is sort of attributed as responsible for the formation of the Environmental Protection Agency, is this book, Silent Spring, by Rachel Carson. And then the Silent Spring, the name for that, or the reason it's called Silent Spring, is because there was a chemical being sprayed that was accumulating in birds, and we'll talk about this later in quarter more specifically, but the chemical was accumulating in birds and in the shells of birds, or the shells of the eggs of their offspring, and it wasn't allowing them to survive. So the Silent Spring is the spring that she wrote the book. She noticed that there was no birds singing because they had all died from the spraying of that chemical. And then ultimately, sort of these different environmental situations help lead to the Environmental Protection Agency ultimately being formed, and then ultimately monitoring the quality of air, water, soil, and just the environment in general. But like I said recently, in specifically the ability to regulate carbon emissions from different states the Supreme Court has sort of weakened the EPA's ability to do that. In chapter 4, we look at the human population. So we can see still going up, but it's going up slightly less. Well, not slightly less. It is going up much less slowly than it was, but it's still increasing relatively fast. And that's going to be a factor in terms of the food production and the resources we use. And sort of related to that, if we need to produce more food, that might mean we need more pesticides. So we'll look to see what the environmental impact of pesticides are. That's actually what my graduate research focused on, was pesticides. And then we'll also see genetically modified organisms. Those can sometimes be a little bit of a hot button issue. Some people are super against GMOs. I think they're actually very useful, but there are somewhat valid reasons for concerns there. So we'll look at both sides of that issue. And then, like I said, we'll also kind of be looking at a lot of these topics from sort of a social justice lens. So with the food distribution, for example, we'll see that there actually is plenty of food on the planet to feed everybody. The issue is sort of the allocation of that food. Where we're sending it is often to wealthy countries where a lot of it's going to waste. And that kind of goes into the overall distribution of resources in general. We'll see, for example, the United States and Europe use about half of all metal, or account for half of all metal usage, I should say, while only accounting for 20% of the global population. So there's a inequitable sort of distribution there. And we'll see that's kind of the case with a lot of these issues. But like I was talking about before, biodiversity is advantageous because it kind of makes the ecosystem as a whole stronger because it gives it more variety. We'll see that's kind of the case with a lot of different things when we talk about like natural selection and just the population, survival of a population. But one of the main issues facing environmental science as a field is just the loss of biodiversity. So we're seeing pretty wide scale extinction, and it's going to be due to things like global warming, habitat destruction, and even just things like introducing different organisms. If we bring in an exotic organism, it could just be just anything that's not from that area. If we bring that in, that's going to obviously disrupt the food web, and that could be a problem for different organisms that already exist there. But ultimately, what we're going to be doing in this course is hopefully looking at how we can sort of address and solve some of these issues. And we're going to be focused on a lot is conservation and preservation to help deal with a lot of this stuff. But we will see that there's also sort of things we can do from an individual scale, as well as sort of a larger collective. And then one of the units that I think is particularly interesting, just because it's probably the most applicable, at least sort of on an immediate scale, if you're thinking about buying a home or just renovating a home, thinking about buying a car, maybe just the energy demands and sort of not where we get, or not just where we get our energy or how we're producing it, but also how much energy are we using. And then, like I was talking about before, particularly with nuclear energy, we'll see that there's nuclear waste, which is one issue. And even though these green energies are all going to be very advantageous to in comparison to fossil fuels, we will also look at some of the drawbacks of each of them as well. Because none of these are going to be a singular perfect solution, but collectively we'll see that they're all going to be quite a good outcome if we can use them in tandem. And then with this, sustainability is going to be another big sort of underlying theme throughout the quarter. And as you can see here, a concept that stresses intergenerational equity, basically just saying that what we're doing is going to help solve the problem that we're facing today, but it's also going to do it in a way that's going to prepare the future to to be able to handle whatever situations may arise then too. We don't want to just do something that's going to fix the solution now, but result in some other big issue later on. We want to kind of think about how we can sustainably, as it would suggest, approach these problems. And then, like I said, environmentally, you can kind of think of that as the science aspect of it. But there's going to be economic. How is this going to affect people? Same thing with, or social is how it's going to be affecting people more. But the economic is always going to be what the cost of it is. Because there may be a very good idea to solve some problem, but if it costs $100 trillion, there's never going to be somebody that's going to be able to sort of fund and support that. So we've got to think about how we can approach these from an economically feasible way as well. And then kind of just to end it, I think, just the reasons for environmentalism, the reason that hopefully as we go through this course, you get a better understanding of the world we live in and why we want to kind of protect it, not only for ourselves and the future generations, but for all of the different organisms throughout it. Pragmatic conservation of natural resources for human use. Obviously, that's just kind of looking at it from our perspective. We want to make sure that what we're doing is going to be something that we can continue to do, support the future generations. Preservation for ethical and aesthetic reasons. So just making sure that what we're doing is ethical. So what we're doing is right. And then aesthetic, kind of just keeping up the appearances. And then what we're really going to be focused on is combating rising pollution levels. So that's one of the big issues facing the planet. You may be familiar with, well, climate change for one, but things like microplastics. You may have heard of PFAS, so per and polyfluoroalkyl alkyl substances. There's a whole bunch of different things that we're going to be talking about, how we can prevent pollution, but how we can also sort of deal with what's already out there. And then ultimately, all of these are going to be sort of boiling down to how we can protect the environment to improve the lives of everybody. So if we've got pollution, for example, it may be something that you don't really think about too much. But one, it's probably going to be something that you don't actually want to look at. If you've ever seen haze above the sky, it's not something, especially if it's like dense, it's not something that you want to be looking at. It can kind of be depressing from that sense, but it's also not something that you want to be breathing in because it's going to negatively impact your health. So we want to think about how we can kind of protect the environment to protect everybody as a whole. But like I said, if there are any sort of topics that you're hoping to look at that you don't think we're going to cover, definitely just either stop by my office, send me a message, whatever it's going to be, and we can kind of figure out how to get that in there.